consequences. Even when your immigration status changes, right, you can't just go back in time and change some decision that you made 3 years prior to that. And this becomes really obvious in terms of family formation because it's sort of this process that you have to engage in, right? But I think it also applies to other things like education or work or different kinds of areas. And then also widespread in that citizens are also impacted, right? So it's not just about the undocumented person, but other people that they're in relationships with. So I draw on sort of 2 waves of data. So 113 in-depth interviews with 92 undocumented young adults, and then 21 recently legalized undocumented young adults. All Latinos, all 20 to 35, and this is all before DACA happened, right? So this was my nice, happy dissertation. I was going to go off and write a book, and then DACA came and changed everything, right? So gave access to driver's licenses in California, gave access to work permits, protection from deportation, access to legalization through the advanced parole policy. So I was like, everything I was going to argue has totally changed. Let's go back and re-interview everybody. So I did, I re-interviewed 69 of my original respondents, and then 30 new people to maintain sort of this larger sample of 90-ish undocumented people. 90 of those in the second wave had DACA, right? Other people didn't for various reasons. And then I tried to make, so I'm also trying to maintain educational comparisons between people that didn't go to college or sort of stopped out at community college and thinking about those as sort of like the less educated sample, and then the more educated people that were in community college or a 4-year university or had graduated with a bachelor's degree. And then also still maintaining the 21 recently legalized permanent residents, many of whom I expected to be citizens by this time because they were eligible, but had not transitioned to citizenship. And then also interviewing romantic partners. So I interviewed whoever was in a romantic relationship. I tried to recruit that partner. And many of these actually are the partners of the permanent residents. And this was sort of, I guess, 2 years ago. So in terms of, so I'm going to try and take you through the entire book in 15 minutes. But the legalization process sort of traced these enduring and widespread effects. So in terms of dating, what becomes really relevant, or what I see a lot of, right, is these gendered expectations and consequences. Right? When we think of dating, we think about all these gendered processes. So this is where driving and IDs become really important in terms of being able to participate in dating expectations and experiences. So Daniel here talks about not being able to live up to sort of the provider expectations that undocumented, or that men in general face while dating, and that becomes difficult for undocumented men. So he says the whole me not being independent thing just started becoming too much for her, because she's the one driving everywhere and I don't even know how to drive. She's like, I'm investing more time in this than you are, and sometimes more money. I think she realized that she might end up having to support me, so she's like, no, it's over. So he talks a lot about this woman in particular breaking up with him in his first interview, but also his second interview. It really stuck with him for a long time. Right, so pointing specifically to not being able to drive, but also to not being able to pay, right, not being able to support her. She was more educated than him because he was having trouble getting through community college. So all of these things were sort of preventing him from living up to what he was expected to do and resulted in their breaking up. Whereas on the other hand, we have Mercedes, who talks about her driver's license not being important for driving because the man is going to pick her up, obviously. But important in terms of being able to do things. So she talks about being denied at a bar, like having her matricula or passport denied. And she said, I think it shows a lot about him, that her date, that even though I got denied, he was like, well, let's go somewhere else. I think that's what made me get more attracted to him, right? So here you have an instance where, and this was sort of pretty frequent, that women were worried about, is their license or their ID going to be denied in terms of getting access to a bar or a club or something, or being denied alcohol at some venue. Whereas men, right, which is more, there was more ways to sort of navigate that and sort of get through it. Whereas men were faced with this, like, how am I going to overcome all of these things, like when I'm trying to make a really good first impression, right? So this is sort of where it starts creating some issues and forming romantic relationships, mainly because men, unable to perform these things, sort of started stepping out of the dating process, right? So Jesus talks about that. And particularly talking about that he hasn't dated someone in the past 2 years, right? Which is kind of an important thing to forming a family. You got to find someone and date them first, I would assume. Right, so he talks about that. He says, let's say my partner wants to go out and she asks me to go out. I don't want to say I don't have any money. It makes me embarrassed. So I want to be the one in power of the situation. And this idea of power, of being in control, of being able to provide comes up a lot for men wanting to be able to sort of perform these roles and fill these roles. So either they want to perform them, but also that women expect them to, which is sort of Daniel's case, right? So this sort of mutual dance that people are doing. So this sort of, right, if you're not able to overcome these initial barriers, then you can't really proceed with this process, which has these sort of long-term and enduring consequences. But it also makes it difficult, so maybe you can date, right, and you can maintain a dating relationship over time, but it makes it difficult to transition into marriage, which is what Raphael talks about. So he's been dating his girlfriend for 3 years at this point, and he says, she wants me to take her from her dad's house to our house. He's like, I don't even have a house. All right? She wants me to buy all the furniture and all that stuff. In my head, I'm just seeing that that's pretty much impossible right now. I can barely afford to live by myself in a rented room and pay for school. Right? And he talked a lot about this and the expectation that she expects him to propose when he graduates, which is in the next quarter or two, and that he's like, it's not going to happen, we're going to have to break up. Right? So we left this interview expecting that he would break up, but then DACA happened. He got a job with his engineering degree, and they were getting married when I interviewed him the second time. Because now he was able to afford these things, right? So this also speaks to the importance of timing in this situation, whereas if DACA had even happened a year later or something else, right, that he wouldn't have been able to fulfill these roles. Maybe he'd get her to buy into the relationship for another year, but who knows, right, if she was really starting to set timelines and not being able to transition and feel comfortable in those transitions, then that's sort of, 3 years wasted in a relationship, right? And having to go sort of look for someone else to be in a relationship with. So then in terms of legalization in marriage, right, sort of another aspect of these laws that are impacting relationships. So there are a lot of messages about legalization through marriage, which Daniela talks about. So she says, if you're dating someone that has papers, they think, oh, you're dating him because he has papers. If you're dating someone who doesn't have papers, they're like, are you stupid? What's wrong? Go and date someone that has papers. So you feel like people are judging you because they think that all you want is to get that antidote. And she talks a lot about this antidote of marriage and how this is the thing that people are always trying to set expectations, that this is what you're trying to solve, right? This is your problem. So all of your life decisions should be based on acquiring documentation, right? And the judgment that comes with that, but also that puts a lot of pressure on people and sort of shaping, right? Should all your life decisions be based on your immigration status? And there's a lot of acceptance of that and rejection of that idea, and not wanting to let your legalization control. It controls so much, but how are you going to let it control like your heart, right, and your love? So there's this discussion of intimacy, right? That there's this resistance to letting it actually control that part of your life. Which these messages do control that, which was what Abel talks about, having enduring relationship consequences, particularly in relationship to partner preferences. So Abel talks about, I don't waste my time, I don't waste my money, I don't try, I don't care if they're cute, I don't go out with undocumented girls. So he's got a really intense, this was a really weird interview, but he's got a really intense rule about not dating people that are undocumented. Other people are less intense, but there are definitely, there were a lot of people that had very specific rules about not dating other undocumented people. And a lot of that actually, what I find, lines up along education lines. So those who have more experience in higher education are more likely to have partner preferences for only citizen people. And a lot of that doesn't come with it's not higher education, it makes you something. But more that your experiences in higher education are highly marginalizing, and your peer groups then become citizens who are experiencing a lot of upward mobility. So you experience your undocumented status as particularly limiting, more so than in other people that are not seeing these kinds of mobility. So this sort of shapes early relationships, right? Not starting them. And there's a lot of anger and frustration about or heartbreak about not being able to pursue potential relationships because of their undocumented status. But then people also struggle with breaking up with citizen partners because of what that means. So Lily talks about being in a relationship with somebody who used to be undocumented, was a permanent resident, was about to become a citizen, but they were like not working out. It'd been 3 or 4 years, and she was struggling with this idea about, do I break up with him because I know this is not a healthy relationship? or do I stick it out so that I can fix my status, and maybe it'll get better. So sort of having to manage that and considering these things in your decisions about continuing a relationship or not. So it also impacts partners and these expectations that you should be helping your undocumented partner. So Rudy talks about that. So he's the citizen husband of a documented woman, right? In theory, she hasn't traveled through advanced parole, so there's not an easy pathway for her to legalization. But there still is expectations from his family and from other friends and stuff that he should just fix her status already, right? That this is his role in this relationship, and why isn't he doing that? And there's a lot of judgment about that, right? So partners then sort of being expected to participate in these experiences. Partners also impacting decisions to legalize, which is what Nicole talks about in particular. In her case, she was really afraid of deportation. She's one of the few that was actually afraid about the deportation of her partner. I think because she is white and doesn't have experience with sort of anything about undocumented people. But also talking about their limited upward mobility and expectations that he had come on a visa, so this was easy. So they actually started dating, and 6 months later got married, and then started the legalization process. So really, and she was the sort of driving force behind that, trying to convince him that this was what they needed to do to sort of build their lives together. And then these consequences after legalization endure, right? So these people are permanent residents. They've been permanent residents for 3, 4, 5 years by the time I interviewed them the second time. And it still has these consequences of their undocumented status. So Sophie talks about this in particular in relationship to now, we're married, but we're trying to build our careers because they got married right after college. And she said, maybe it would have been better if we could have done it previous to it. He could have stayed and focused on his job, and I could have done the same, right? So having to make concessions about their sort of career opportunities because of their now family responsibilities, right? And people who became permanent residents talk about this a lot. They became permanent residents so they could travel the world, but you can't do that if you're trying to build a family and do all these things because now you have a family and these responsibilities too, right? So this decision has opened up doors, but then you can't go through them because of all the decisions that you've made, right, to sort of do that. And then the marriage myth also reemerges in terms of how are you going to navigate this? So this is Santos, Sophie's husband, and Santos is the one who was legalized. So he talks about expectations about people are going to start questioning what went wrong if they break up because they were having some problems. And obviously one of the options she's going to think is, well, maybe you're not into it. Maybe you just wanted this legalization, so now you've got it and you can walk away. So really struggling. Right, so these expectations and these fears and these messages about legalization is only through marriage, and that's the only reason why you would do it, not for love. Sort of follows you into your relationship even after that process is completed. And then I'm out of time, so I'm not going to talk about parenting, but children are also affected, and it's terrible. Yeah, so that's sort of my case for context of illegality. I'd love to hear what you have to say afterwards.
We move from the sphere of intimacy, the family partnership, to the labor market.
So, like Laura, this is going to be a chapter of my book focusing on community of street vendors in Los Angeles. And so I'm an ethnographer, and oftentimes we tell little stories about communities and people. And what I'm trying to do in today's presentation is really talk about what is happening within this community of street vendors and link that to larger national trends that we saw happening around the same time between 2006 and 2012. And so the focus of this paper and it's one of the first sort of chapters of my book that is trying to build up the context and the street vendors. What I'm really interested in this chapter is really the impact of local level immigrant movements, right? And this has actually been gaining traction a lot in literature recently, and to sort of connected with contrasting ways. So scholars have studied how local level regulatory responses to immigration issues have affected immigrants. So the first set of research is really concerned with talking about the devolution of immigration enforcement from federal agencies like ICE, to local level agencies like sheriff's departments and police departments, where sheriffs and police officers on the ground in local contexts are charged with immigration enforcement powers, right? Are given immigration enforcement powers. And so this is a really interesting sort of line of research, just talking about how immigration control is now becoming a local level enforcement issue. So that's one really interesting line of research. The other line of research that corresponds more closely to what I'm going to talk about today is the indirect way that local laws can end up being immigration enforcement laws, right? And so Ivan Light really talked about this in the context of quality of life ordinances. And so one of the major claims that he makes in this book, Deflecting Immigrants, is that cities, this book is largely focused on Los Angeles. And so he's saying in this book that within Los Angeles, the city council really began doing, or targeting poverty, right? We started working on legislation that was anti-poverty, that in effect ended up also targeting poor immigrants, right? And so the ordinances that he ends up talking in this book have to do with violations of wage, health, and safety and housing ordinances, right? So any sort of violations of labor, so shutting down sweatshops and whatnot, violations of housing, some slumlords. So he's saying that in the process of policing these entities, you end up also policing poor immigrants who end up working in the sweatshops, who end up living in slum housing because they can't afford anything else. And so the major argument that he's trying to make is you end up policing poverty and you end up policing poor immigrants. And so the solution that these immigrants have in these cities like Los Angeles is to go to another city, right? So the whole point of the book is these local level anti-poverty ordinances end up policing immigrants and forcing them to other contexts, right? And so in the book he really talks about how poor, largely undocumented immigrants in Los Angeles ended up going to other cities, right? Where they were less poverty intolerant. And so in this sort of chapter, I'm hooking my idea onto this, this nugget that Ivan Light is providing. And I'm also talking about, like, well, he doesn't really mention it in the book, but anti-vending ordinances in Los Angeles actually fall under this quality of life umbrella, right? Because Los Angeles has one of the most restrictive anti-vending ordinances in the country. And most vendors in Los Angeles are Latino. A lot of them are recent arrivals, they're immigrants. And these ordinances police their work. They police their livelihood, right? And so it's a really big deal in Los Angeles. And this is how Los Angeles on a local level begins to create illegality, right? The Los Angeles Municipal Court, like I said, has the most restrictive anti-vending policy in the country. And it is very broadly written. It prohibits all vending on public sidewalks, period. You would never know it from the number of vendors that there are in Los Angeles, but this is what the LA Municipal Code says. In addition to that, the county code prohibits vending from commercial vehicles or push carts without a valid business license. There's another county code section that prohibits vending on public sidewalks, right? So these are the local level ordinances that begin to police immigrants, right? Who are also poor immigrants, in the same way that sort of Ivan Light began that discussion. And so within LA, there are multiple agencies that are charged with enforcing these laws. So with regards to the LA Municipal County Code, you have the LA Police Department, right? They're the ones charged with enforcing any violations. And so the LA Municipal Code is actually really extensive, and I actually sat down once when I was a grad student just to read what kind of things are illegal in Los Angeles, and I realized that you can't ride on the handlebars of a bike. You know, so like there's almost a code for every sort of thing that you could find that would put you in violation of some ordinance that would allow the police to give you a citation. Right, so the county code and the municipal code are enforced largely by the LAPD at their discretion, right? They can choose to ticket you or not ticket you for riding the handlebars of a bike, just like they can choose to ticket you or not ticket you for vending, but they can also, they have more discretion according to this county code. So vendors can get ticketed for vending in the public right of way, they can get ticketed for being a public nuisance, they can get ticketed for littering, they can get ticketed for a wide range of issues, right, within the municipal county code. But because they're street vendors who sell food products, they're also subjected to California retail food code violations, right? And so these are enforced by the Los Angeles Health Department and the Bureau of Street Services, right? So here, you're beginning to see how the local level laws on the books and the local level agencies, and there are many of them, begin to police street vendors, and more generally police immigrants, right? And so this is significant because of the numbers of people that could potentially get policed just on these grounds, right? And these are very, very rough estimates. The Economic Roundtable has said that these numbers are actually really low, but Lorena Munoz basically said that there are about 10,000 vendors operating in Los Angeles on any given day. The Economic Roundtable has actually put the number closer to 50,000. It's very difficult to get a count on street vendors, just like it's very difficult to get a count on homeless populations, right? So we have these estimates that we're working with. With the vendors that I was working with, we estimated that there are about 1,000 fruit vendors. So these are just vendors who sell made-to-order fruit salads out of push carts, like a very the parameters are push cart, you make fruit salads, and so among the vendors, we kind of tried to see, looking at how many vendors store their carts in commissaries, how many commissaries there are in Los Angeles, how many vendors they know don't store their carts in commissaries. So we sat down, and this is what we came across, right? So you have these local laws of police immigrants in the context of vending, right? And later on, I'll talk about other ways that these immigrants are policed, right? Not as street vendors, but as immigrants. So you have these local level processes operating, but also on a local level, you have federal immigration that is really important, right? And begins to transform what it means to be policed for being a street vendor when you're also an undocumented immigrant. And so one of the most important things that kind of changes the equation is the implementation of secure communities, right? Which is the information sharing program that distributes information between federal, state, and local enforcement agencies. Which means that if you're undocumented and you end up in jail for vending on the street, that information of you being in that local precinct jail is suddenly transmitted to every other agency. So if you had previously been arrested for coming into the country without papers, that anti-vending arrest triggers a whole wave of horrible for you, right? So that you might have gotten arrested for vending on the street corner, but because of secure communities, you are now able to be deported or taken into ICE custody, right? So it completely transforms the games for some of these individuals. So, just to give you a context of what this work is based off, I spent 5 years with street vendors working among them, right? And so I did interviews with a community of 22 of them, and then I followed them between work and home spaces, and then I also did work as a vendor myself over 2 summers. So one of the important things to note about this population is that the large majority of them are men. They're men from states like Puebla and Oaxaca. A few of them are Guatemalan. And we know from the literature, specifically Perret or Honda Sotela's work and Tanya Golesh-Bosa's work, that deportations and immigrant policing is largely targeting Latino working class men, right? So they talk about in their work how this process of detention and deportation is actually gendered and class-based, right? And so here you have fruit vendors who are working class immigrant men, who are Latinos, who are darker skinned from southern Mexico and Guatemala, who become the ideal target of immigration processes, but which the literature on policing also tells us are the ideal target of local level police officers, right? Who target Latino and Black men at disproportionately high rates. And so you have policing, you know that they're likely to get policed at higher levels, and then you know that they work and operate in public spaces, right? So you're beginning to see all these larger elements that make this a particularly vulnerable population for policing efforts, right? The other thing that complicates this, and again, this is a chapter that's kind of building up, kind of like it's layering the complexity of fruit vendors' presence on the street and how vulnerable they are because of these different interacting things, right? So, like I said earlier, they can get arrested or ticketed for vending in the public right of way. They can be ticketed for being a public nuisance, for littering, for loitering. But then, because they're immigrant men and undocumented, they're policed in other ways, right? So they can and have gotten arrested for driving without a license. They've been arrested for driving under the influence. They've been arrested for domestic disputes, right? So this is the local level policing of them as vendors, and then the local level policing of them as immigrant men, and of any other infraction that they might come across, right? And so I'm not going to go into too many of the specifics of each of the vendors' cases, but what I saw in the aggregate is that 4 of the vendors that I was following across the years ended up opting to, and I'm going to use this horrible term that I think Rami introduced into our language, self-deport. And this is, this is not, they did not use this term, but how they described the circumstances that led them to decide that life in Mexico was better than the life that they were having and finding here is really captured by this idea of self-deport, right? Like, conditions were made so horrible that they chose another way. So 4 of them decided just to return to Mexico because they had been arrested several times, and each arrest brings with it economic hardship, right? Not only are they arrested, but their cars are taken away, their food is confiscated, and they're always kind of on the edge already. So they can't suffer an economic. A cart costs $2,000, which is a really big investment, right? So if a cart is confiscated, that's a major financial blow. And so 4 of them opted to just go back to Mexico, and then in 2011, I went to their small town in Mexico, and I interviewed them just to see what had come of them and whether they regretted the decision and had any kind of aspirations of coming back, and they all said no. They had all kind of started lives and jobs. One was deported. He was arrested for a domestic dispute incident, and he had previously been arrested on the border when he had first tried to come into the United States. And then 2 of them who were arrested, one for vending and one for driving without a license, were actually tracked with ankle monitors. So they weren't detained in detention centers and they weren't deported, but they were caught in this system of surveillance, right? Where they had ankle monitors put on them, and for a period of about a year, and they had to do monthly check-ins. They were open to home visits from their social workers. They had to pay fines. The driving without a license guy had to go to some classes. So it was financially devastating, right? And so for a period of about a year, he was surveilled. These 2 were surveilled, and so. Again, I'm telling a really small story about what's happening to these vendors in this local context and how these local laws that aren't meant to be immigration laws become immigration laws, right? But I'm also trying to see how what was happening within this community, and again, I'm visiting these vendors between 2006 and 2012, right? This is the time that I'm with them. How what happened within this vendor community fits with the larger patterns that we were seeing within the country. And so the Pew was, throughout this period, is always putting out really excellent reports, right? And you were seeing in exactly the same time period, starting in 2005, a decrease in immigration, right? That was kind of related to the Great Recession, but also linked to these increased policing and deporting activity, right? We see the same thing here. This is again from the Pew, showing just California, the number of immigrants in California. So you start to see. And this is like really fascinating to me and to everyone who studies immigration, because for a long time there was no stop, like there was no idea, that nobody would have ever thought, I think, before the Great Recession, that immigration numbers would, 1, stabilize, and 2, start to dip, right? So this is really interesting data that the Pew Center is putting out, and which in this chapter I'm trying to link to this smaller community that I'm studying, right? This is happening within this small community, and it's important, but look at the immigration trends, and is perhaps what's happening among street vendors indicative of these larger trends on the national level? And that's really what I'm trying to do in this chapter, and so I welcome any questions and discussion on this issue.
Danny, presenting on detention centers.
So this is really a working project. So I'm really trying to understand not only what happens within detention centers, but specifically with this paper, what happens to people who are either gay or transgender in detention. And so I'm going to try and go through just like the puzzling case, right, in this instance. Can't really see that well, but I have here like images of some of the organizing that's been occurring around LGBT immigrants in detention. And on the left, it's the Not One More campaign. So the idea behind this campaign has been really to question like deportations, right, and really challenge the Obama administration for one. And so this happened in 2014, and it happens right across my field site, which is no coincidence, right? So the location that I'm doing my field work is the only detention facility designated for LGBT immigrants in all of the United States, right? And so it happens to be, unfortunately, right, an ideal site, but also like the still one space, right, that is designated again only for LGBT immigrants. And although there are like LGBT immigrants across the United States and other facilities, this is just like the one space where ICE usually tends to funnel people into this location. Either they're like previously transferred or they're seeking asylum and they end up here in this facility, right? And so on the right, I have a picture of Jenny Gutierrez. So some of you may remember, but she's an activist, organizer, a transgender woman, and she really stood up and courageously questioned like Obama directly, right? I think it happened during, I believe it was like LGBT Pride Month. So Obama was just sort of talking about some of the progress that the country has made, and Jenny said really questioned this, right, and said, well, so much about progress, like why don't you release people who are LGBT, right? Why don't you release people who are transgender from detention, right? She really questioned this issue about what happens to people who are transgender in detention, right? And I met Jenny a couple weeks ago at an event in Santa Ana, and she keeps like doing this kind of work, right, in terms of like questioning not only what's happening broadly, like in terms of like deportations and detention, but really questioning what happens to populations that identify as gay and transgender, right, and who may face like greater obstacles, right, than just generally like what we think about or who we think about when we think about detention. Right? So I'm just going to go through this very quickly. So I think we've all heard about this, right?